Special thanks to our founding partner, Patagonia Workwear, built for folks who bust ass on the daily to leave our home planet better than they found it.
Welcome back to another episode of Against the Grain, the Farm Aid podcast that brings conversations from farmers, organizers, and artists to your ears, just like we do at our annual festival. I'm Jessica Elise Kern.
And I'm Michael Stewart Foley. Jess, to get us into the subject of this episode about this country and our connection to the land, let's start off with a performance by the Red Clay Singers from the 2022 Farm Aid Festival in Raleigh, North Carolina.
I really think it's beautiful that you all have invited us here to get this event started off in a good way. And we just really wanted to share a song about where we come from. The words mean we come from the pine trees and the red clay. We are of this earth. All right, stay with us.
That full performance, which also featured members of the Wisdom Indian dancers, resplendent in their traditional dress, dancing to the rhythm of the drums, is available up on our podcast website, farmaid.org/podcast.
Yeah, every year, the Farm Aid Festival is kicked off with a celebratory performance from the Wisdom Indian dancers, and sometimes others, to ground us in the history of the land that we all inhabit and to honor the First Peoples. Because as we all know, the history of the United States was, in part, built on the oppression and persecution of indigenous peoples, marked by land theft, violence, and what can only be described as ethnic cleansing.
In Episode 3 of Against the Grain, we focused on Black land theft and the loss of millions of acres of Black-owned farmland. In this episode, we'll begin our exploration of Native American agriculture by focusing on food and land sovereignty, and that can't be untangled from European colonization.
Yeah, for a lot of Americans, this all seems like ancient history that we learned about in grade school. Stories that we learned about Thanksgiving and Pocahontas and Sacagawea leading Lewis and Clark. But as we'll hear in this episode, Native Americans are still subject to the oppressive laws and treaties put into place over a century ago. That results in a kind of systemic marginalization, one part of which has to do with food access and food production.
Right, so now we're exploring questions like where are we now and what rights do the 574 federally recognized tribes have to the land? Kari Jo Lawrence and Abby Fain of the Intertribal Agriculture Council and Bleu Adams of Indigehub sat down with us to talk about how tribes feed their communities given the limited rights.
We were recently introduced to activist and chef Bleu Adams at the Luck Reunion Festival, which took place on Willie Nelson's ranch outside of Austin, Texas, this past March.
Bleu runs the Black Sheep Cafe, a restaurant in Provo, Utah, renowned for its innovative dishes that feature indigenous foods and cultural practices. Bleu is an incredible source for frontline access to the issues we are exploring.
My name is Bleu Adams. I am Mandan, Haratsa, and Dina. I come from the communities of Cross Canyon, Arizona, and Mandaree, North Dakota. I currently reside in Provo, Utah. I am the director of Indigehub.org. We are a 501c3 organization that works to support micro-entrepreneurship in rural indigenous communities with a focus on food.
When it comes to food sovereignty, which refers to a community's right to produce and distribute its own food, one of the terms that gets thrown around a lot is food desert, usually in reference to the absence of good quality, nutritious food in a particular geographic area. But as Bleu tells us, there's a passivity implied in that term that's misleading, as if it were somehow a naturally occurring phenomenon.
You often hear that term, food desert, but in particular cases in indigenous communities, we use the term food apartheid because it's the result of political policy from the mid-1800s, 1864, specific for the Navajo Nation. There was a campaign they called the Scorched Earth Policy. And the scorched policy was the destruction of traditional food systems as a means to get the Navajo and surrounding tribes to submit to the government before marching them to a concentration camp in Bosque Redondo. That journey we call the Long Walk, and the Navajo people and again other tribal members were there for about 4 years before the Treaty of 1868, where they were allowed back onto portions of their land without access to food. And so to supplement their diet with processed canned food commodities that were provided by the government. Some of the dishes that we serve today, such as fry bread, Navajo tacos, etc., come from that.
This food apartheid did not end in the 19th century. Forcing tribes to submit to the U.S. government has been baked into all policies regarding tribal lands, their land use, and other business transactions they have.
We're talking over 160 plus years of federal policy that has created such a chokehold for specifically the Navajo Nation. Much of our land is held in federal trust, and it's a very lengthy and expensive process to get construction permits, business permitting, to figure out the taxation codes for small businesses and entrepreneurs.
Ultimately, the work that Bleu does at Indigehub aims to circumvent these policies so that community members can be entrepreneurial and keep money and resources within the community.
I believe we're the only demographic with a 24-hour economic leakage where we get paid on the first of the month or on a Friday, and the money's gone to the border towns by Sunday. There's nowhere to reinvest locally, and that's what we're working on. That is the priority for us. And to me, the answer is food. It really is. It's access to food. We can't call ourselves a sovereign nation. We can't call ourselves independent and self-sufficient unless we have access to food. Speaking about the Navajo Nation, we're the size of West Virginia. We have 13 operating grocery stores, and that serves a fluctuating population of about 350 to 400,000 citizens. You're traveling up to an hour for a grocery store creates heavy reliance on fast food, gas station food, etc. So we work now to empower our local farmers, growers, food producers.
The picture Bleu paints is pretty grim. With this array of challenges facing tribal communities, it's hard for them to not only grow food, but to grow income. To go a little deeper into the problems that tribal producers face, we spoke at some length with Kari Jo Lawrence and Abby Fain of the Intertribal Agriculture Council. You'll hear from them when we come back.
And just a quick word to say thanks to our founding sponsor, Patagonia Workwear, built for the ones who don't wait around, the ones who prove that it's possible to make a good living on a living planet.
We're currently cooking up plans for Farm Aid 2024. Stay tuned to our social media accounts for an announcement in the next few weeks about when and where the festival will be and how to get tickets. Head to our website to learn more, www.farmaid.org.
He came dancing across the water with his galleons and guns, looking for the new world and that palace in the sun on the shore lay Montezuma.
Welcome back. That was Farm Aid board member Neil Young and Promise of the Real playing Cortez the Killer, just one of Neil's many songs calling attention to the mistreatment of indigenous peoples. That was at Farm Aid 2017 in Burgettstown, Pennsylvania.
Another longtime Farm Aid friend, Sarah Vogel, known as the farmer's lawyer, suggested we talk to Kari Jo and Abby.
My name is Kari Jo Lawrence. I am Hidatsa and an enrolled member of the 3 affiliated tribes that is located on the Fort Berthold Indian Reservation, where I was raised on a cattle ranch.
I'm Abby Fain. I'm the Chief Legal and Policy Officer for the Intertribal Agriculture Council. I am a member of the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma, but I'm working out of Tulsa, Oklahoma on the Muskogee Nation Reservation.
In the same way that Bleu was describing, Abby recounted the ways in which bureaucracy, which is often a nightmare for all farmers, is far worse for the tribes because of historical and jurisdictional complications.
There are definitions for Indian country, which talk about trust land, allotments, and restricted fee lands. While there is a lot of tribal trust land or land held in trust by the federal government for the benefit of tribes and tribal people, with that comes a lot of extra steps to participating in federal programs. Because it's the federal government holding it in trust, it triggers things like the National Environmental Policy Act and the National Historic Preservation Act. So an individual farmer or rancher will have to do cultural surveys or different kinds of surveys than what a producer operating on fee land would have to do. Or a producer would have to get approvals from the Department of the Interior or their tribe before they can fully participate in a USDA program.
You know, Michael, when I think about this, I keep coming back to the point that all of this land on this continent was taken from the First Peoples. And it's pretty horrific that to this day, one of the biggest underlying problems that tribal farmers face is who owns the land. And this is within their own nations. As things stand, the U.S. government holds the rights to much of it. The Bureau of Indian Affairs, or the BIA, is a liaison between the tribes and the U.S. government. But tribal farmers still run into problems accessing vital agriculture programs. That's like loans and conservation programs and crop insurance. Again, here's Abby Fain.
So if we have a producer who is interested in getting a loan from FSA, they have to show that they have ownership or control over the land. If it's trust land, then they have to go to the BIA or their tribe and get some type of documentation that says, yes, they have control of this land for this amount of time, and then take that to the USDA. There are instances where getting that type of information can take months. There are instances where a producer might miss out on a loan, might miss out on an opportunity. Something very unique to tribal producers on tribal lands is that because they're held in trust by the federal government for the benefit of tribes or individual tribal members, when a producer tries to access credit through a banks are historically and even to this day very reluctant to collateralize the land. Doesn't mean they can't, it just means that they won't.
None of these bureaucratic hassles are new, of course. Just like Farm Aid, the Intertribal Agriculture Council emerged in response to the farm crisis of the 1980s, with a very specific focus on the government-manufactured obstacles that blocked the way forward for so many tribal producers. In fact, in the 1980s, the likelihood that a tribal farmer or rancher would be foreclosed on was 5 times greater than the national average.
The U.S. government undermining the tribe's abilities to be self-sufficient is a theme that continues to this day. As Abby and Kari Jo explained, at every turn, the tribe saw their lands taken away and replaced with insufficient substitutions.
While there is a lot of land, I would say we look at the entire country as being Indian land or tribal land that was taken. But what is left in trust isn't what people would necessarily consider prime agriculture land. And Kari Jo, I know, can speak to that specifically, even within her own tribe.
You can look on a map right now. You can look at an Indian reservation in North or South Dakota, and you can overlay a soils map, and where all of those good soils are at that are tillable, that are high productive land, they are not owned by Indians. Those lands are most likely in fee status and not operated by Indian producers.
On top of being given this lousy land, the U.S. government went on to build dams on tribal lands. The problem there being that when you dam a river, the land up the river gets flooded and uninhabitable. Kari Jo tells us about the building of the Garrison Dam on the Missouri River in North Dakota in the 1940s. The effects were devastating for her community, and they were ultimately displaced.
98% of our farmland was flooded when this all happened in the late 1940s. I grew up in the town called Newtown, and that's where the Elbow Woods and all the different communities moved up onto the higher ground. It was rich, fertile river bottom farmland that was taken at that time. And it highly, highly affected our tribe in a negative way. People, you never heard of the word unemployment before. You never heard of the word hungry before. That was unheard of. But after the flooding happened, that's still living in that and haven't fully recovered.
The big takeaway seems to be that if the land was valuable in any way, the U.S. government has always found a way to seize control and leave tribal suffering in its wake. And as you can imagine, in the same way that we talked about in episode 3, so many Black farmers have been hesitant to engage with the USDA following a century of discrimination and land theft. Similarly, many Native producers won't even respond to government surveys about farming on tribal land.
Yeah, this long history, marked by land theft, discrimination, and fueling widespread distrust, only makes it harder for the next generation of tribal farmers and ranchers to get started. But there is some hope with amazing organizations like Intertribal Agriculture Council and Indigehub.
Yeah, thankfully, folks like Abby and Kari Jo and Bleu have given us some reason to be hopeful. Here's Bleu talking about how her organization, Indigehub, is bringing a circular economy back to tribal lands and keeping the wealth within the tribes themselves.
These are components of a healthy economy. I see it here in Provo, Utah, one of the strongest economies. And that's why we're here, because of that insulated. I think our revenue circulates about 6 to 8 times before it leaves. And it's that ethos of Mormon to Mormon business, hyper local. We don't have a single chain in our downtown, chain restaurant. And when we're talking about restaurants, when you're talking about buying local and the impact it has on the local economy by reinvesting 35 to 45% of the money immediately in that circling, restaurants are unique. Mom and pop restaurants where they can reinvest up to 85% of that revenue locally before it leaves. That's why we're focused on food. That's why we understand that food is economy. And until we have access to food, we're not going to build an economy.
So Bleu secured shipping containers to create food hubs and start rebuilding the economy. Why shipping containers? Because over 90% of Navajo land is subject to a complex web of federal bureaucratic rules, which makes it extremely difficult to build a structure on their own land. So Bleu thought outside the box and found a mobile solution. Enter shipping containers.
And right now we have the food hub, which is a 40-foot shipping container that we're converting to provide, again, minimal infrastructure for a farmer. And when I'm talking about minimal, refrigeration, a sink where she can rinse her vegetables, some shelter where she can lock up her tools and her equipment. And we're also working with Kai's Pies out in Laguna Pueblo. He is starting a mobile kitchen for the community. He's funding it with the sale of pizza, but it'll be used for classes, cooking classes, different community events, and also a media studio so he can tell the story of his community. We don't want to take ownership over their projects. We just want to provide capital and skills and training and mentorship for them. When we took over the property, it's 12 little tiny hubs. Immediately got rid of drug dealers. I mean, when we got there, meth, prostitution, assaults, etc. We're in year 2 now. Every little building is filled. There's 3 food businesses. There's a hair stylist. There's a coffee shop. We anchored it with cricket just because everybody needs cell service. Cleaned it all up. But the stories. So when we're talking about food insecurity, we also have to talk about community violence. We're not talking about the homicides, the suicides, the assaults. Those tie directly into nutrition and access to healthy food.
Projects like Kai's Pies and an effort to bring back the Navajo peach, to cite just 2 examples, are slowly and steadily making a real difference in the community. For more stories from tribal lands, subscribe and follow Against the Grain.
In future episodes, we will continue to illustrate the array of challenges facing tribal producers, from infrastructure to bureaucracy to lack of credit to land and soil issues, while also pointing out glimmers of success and hope.
I feel really impassioned about the inequities that tribal members face in this country. If you do as well, head to our website and learn more about each of these organizations. Go to www.farmaid.org/podcast.
And we'd love to hear from you. How did you like this episode? Do you have any questions or comments? Email us at podcast@farmaid.org or give us a shout out on FarmAid's social media, which is at FarmAid on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and Threads.
And don't forget YouTube, where you can watch almost 40 years of performances and other content. It means a lot to the podcast if you share it with your friends and subscribe on your podcast app of choice.
Yes, good reminder. Please like, subscribe, and give us a rating wherever you listen to us. Against the Grain was written and produced by us, with sound editing by End House Media and direction from Don Sorokin.
Thanks so much to Kari Jo Lawrence, Abby Fain, and Bleu Adams for being wonderful guests and helping us work through such complicated issues. And thank you, as always, for listening to Against the Grain.
And a huge thank you to all the farmers out there. We'll chat with you next time.
Patagonia Workwear. We build durable, timeless gear for the ones who prove that food production, skilled trades, construction, and ecosystem restoration can and should cause the least amount of harm, and that it's possible to make a good living on a living planet.